Welcome to the next episode of the podcast on negotiation. And today we will tackle a very serious topic the topic of why negotiations have failed in the case of the Russian Ukraine conflict. And together with me, I have an expert with over 2 decades in education, research, conflict management. Who is based in Moscow, Russia, who has seen the latest developments, who has witnessed the latest developments from an analyst perspective, based in the country, who is a member of the program on negotiation, the process of international negotiation steering committee, an international group dealing with international relations and conflict management, a very accomplished scholar, Mikhail Troitskiy. Mikhail, thank you for being with us. Would you like to add anything to your introduction?
Oh, I think I'm proud of that introduction, and thank you very much, Remy, for having me.
You are very welcome. Great. We feel very honored that you have decided to join us. Let us start with from the beginning, as always, right? So, Mikhail, could you share a little bit of a perspective on the genesis of this conflict, yes, between Russia and Ukraine? How did it all start? When did it all start? If you could give us some background on this, I think that would set the scene very nicely.
Yeah. Thank you, Remy, again. And that is indeed an important question. But I also realize it may now look irrelevant because of the fighting, of the horrific circumstances that set in after February 24th. And it is really difficult from a moral perspective to look back beyond February 24th, as many of your viewers surely feel, and the loss of life and damage is hard to imagine. And at this time, I don't really see how we may be able to make it right by everyone who has suffered. And of course, as an international affairs analyst, in this case, especially a Russian one, and every international affairs analyst should probably have a nagging feeling of responsibility for not being able to avert February 24th, as well as, of course, later developments. So what analysts could have done is a difficult question, and it depends on the concrete position or job, but likely not much from my perspective. Now, after this preamble, if we can go back 2 decades or even 1 decade, looking for the genesis, the question was about Ukraine's membership in economic blocs, really. And then it kind of evolved towards prospective membership in NATO, and also the specific policies by the governments of Russia and Ukraine. So back 9 years ago, I co-authored a paper about what was called the integration dilemma. And it happens when a country becomes insecure because it seems to be losing the competition for members in the bloc that it leads. Okay, and that competition in its mild forms unfolded a while ago, about 10 years ago, as Ukraine was negotiating its association agreement with the European Union. And that seemed to me to be at the core of the controversy. And clearly, Russia didn't want that to happen. And of course, that relatively mild controversy that we and my co-author back then argued could have been resolved, that controversy was magnified and really overridden by Crimea and Donbass. And then later on, I became really worried when I saw that the Minsk process stalled. Again, I'm not assigning the blame here, but I'm just saying it wasn't working out, and Moscow was becoming increasingly frustrated, and so I think was Kiev. But what ultimately happened was in no way preordained. So we can talk about Genesis writ large, but decisions to start hostilities result from a unique dynamic. unique sequence of events. So I'm not sure I have, and we can discuss it later. But at this point, I wouldn't just put it in my analysis of the genesis. So the genesis is longer term, and it was about blocks. It was about Ukraine's orientation and Russia's own identity that was in large part shaped by Ukraine as the significant other. But other than those general terms, I'm not sure what I can say at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mihhail, for giving us a background to this conflict. So when we think about from a conflict, a theoretical perspective, yes, from a conflict resolution or conflict management perspective, how would we define the interest? Was it all about security of the main stakeholders, or the willingness to shift the focal point of Ukraine from east to west? What is in your opinion? What is what are the interests on both sides? What does Russia really want or expect? Yes, from it, and what are main Ukrainian interests?
That's a very good question, Remy. And I think the bottom line here is that post February 24th, the interests seem to have been evolving. So as of now, Ukraine wants to return territory, and that is clearly opposed to what Russia is up to. But other than that, the partners of both sides or their bottom lines are not clear. And I don't have a formula really to describe them, and they evolve constantly. So the Russian leadership talks about prevailing in a conflict with not just Ukraine, but also Ukraine's Western supporters, mainly NATO countries. And how such victory could look like, it is, hard to imagine, although you may think in different terms. So we can only hope there will be more specificity at a later stage in the evolution of the conflict, when the sides really define their positions in a form that may become at some point compatible. But what I'm saying is that the interests are constantly evolving, and that's how I see them for the moment. But I'm sure we'll see plenty of change in the coming weeks for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mikhail. I'm wondering, I've been listening carefully to your answer, and I was wondering, about. It seems, if we look at the two sets of interests, so reconcilable. There seems to be so many possibilities, yes, to resolve this conflict before it escalated. And I even recently read an article which you kindly forwarded to me, that resolution options were on the table. So it must be about something more than just shift to the east, shift to the west, being able to demonstrate a particular role in the region, right? A leadership role in the region for Russia. So the question is, it seems, at least on the level of interest that we've just defined, so easily reconcilable. So why did it erupt into a violent conflict?
Well, I think we can split this question into two parts. One is long-term, and we addressed it at the beginning when we discussed the sources of controversy, and observers may disagree, but it's just one side of the problem, the longer-term genesis of the controversy. But of course, the most exciting question and the most important one, at least for historians, is the shorter term, the run-up to the actual start of the armed hostilities. And there, we know. So what I would do, trying to answer your question using short-term factors, would be to see if we can do counterfactuals, if we can find just some relatively small developments, relatively small shifts or events that could have been averted, that could have gone differently, so that February 24th wouldn't happen. So we know a number of things for fact if we are to believe reputed media. One is what you just mentioned, and it is that negotiation was ongoing at the level of very senior officials between Russia and Ukraine Ukraine was apparently willing to concede neutrality at some point, maybe already post February 24th, and contours of such a deal was being discussed in the days in late February, but eventually Russia didn't accept it. The story has it. But what exactly was on the table, what the offer from Ukraine was at that time is difficult to know, and that's one. Then it was clear at the same time that Russia, it wasn't clear what Russia would consider a sufficient concession at that moment. So the ask was very, very big and unrealistic as a whole, for sure, but it was almost entirely turned down, almost entirely rejected by Ukraine and by NATO. Now, at the same time, Ukraine wasn't thinking that military action by Russia was inevitable. Ukrainian officials didn't take the threat with all seriousness, so they may not have been prepared for significant concessions. Just because they downplayed the risk, downplayed Russia's resolve, apparently, in that situation. And the United States, for their part, saw military action as almost inevitable and was sending signals to Ukraine. And then European leaders were coming to Moscow, going back and forth, and were meeting with President Putin, but no commitment was made by either side. And finally, there was, of course, China, an important part of the picture, that signed a comprehensive partnership document with Russia in mid-February that was widely seen as supportive of Russia's position. And now, if I look at that picture, I find it hard to find to do counterfactual analysis. That is, to figure out whether anything specific and reasonably feasible could have stopped this, because the stated views were so much opposed, and it is not clear really if any say one or any two factors of what we just named and listed would have been a game changer. So immediate and quick backing down by both Ukraine and NATO was never seen as a realistic option. But whether there was a way to somehow jumpstart a process that would push military action back in time is not clear. I think we just need more evidence, verifiable evidence. So there may have been a small window in March then when the Istanbul negotiations took place, although the sides' bottom lines were difficult to figure out even then. But then a number of events happened and trends set in that made a quick end game extremely difficult. And Russian public opinion seemed to be supportive. Ukraine's public opinion also turned towards overwhelming support for resistance. And the leading NATO countries pledged full support to Ukraine and even said their goal was to make sure Russia loses and is significantly weakened. So at that point, I think up until today's major bout of escalation, there was little chance for stopping this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was thinking, as you were elaborating on whether the conflict was avoidable and how it could have been prevented. I was thinking all the time about you and millions of Russians prior to February 24th. Did you feel the tension rising and growing in the society? How did you see the crescendo, or did you see that, or did you notice? Did you feel the crescendo as a conflict analyst, yes, an international expert, but also as a member of Russian society? Yes, how did you perceive the February 24th?
Well, throughout the fall and then winter, the tension was clearly growing, and I took the Russian draft treaties, the ones Russia proposed to sign with the United States and then with NATO, and the rhetoric that accompanied those treaties as a very bad sign, a bad sign of the lack of agreement. And my bottom line here is that by mid-February, such processes of discussing potential deals and negotiating were actually winding down from their climax in sometime in June 2021, when the US and Russian presidents met in Geneva. And I tend to agree with those observers, and it's of course not my original view. It has been widely discussed, and I agree with the point of view, with the perspective that Russia and the United States were finding themselves increasingly at odds since September 2021, and there are many witness accounts, such as CIA Director William Burns going to Moscow and then speaking on the record later on, describing his findings and observations. And interestingly, there were many observers in Russia who had criticized the US and NATO at that time for giving Russian demands a rather short shrift, for turning them down effectively. And yet, when the hostilities actually started, those observers said they were shocked. But if you think that the Western response to Russia's very serious demands was not sufficient, why do you rule out direct confrontation? And anyway, if there was a way to stop it when it was in its early stages, as Reuters reported much later, and then after those early weeks, again, it became much more intractable, unfortunately.
I do remember February 24th really well, right? I mean, all those dramatic events that have happened in the times of our life, like, I don't know, like 9/11, September 11th, right? A cause that we remember everything else that has surrounded it, right? Many people also refer to Kennedy's assassination as such a landmark event in their lives, and they can very well remember for many years what they were doing at the moment of finding out that it had happened. Yes, and I also have this memory of February 24th and the vivid exchange of the steering committee members of process of international negotiation, the PIN group, yes, to which steering committee you also belong. And I remember very well the disappointment and disillusionment expressed in which I expressed also in the title of our today's episode. Yes, why did negotiations fail? And this question I would like to address to you. We always teach our students how to be successful in negotiation of various levels, interpersonal, organizational, or I don't know, sometimes political, diplomatic. Now the question is, why in the case of Ukraine and Russia, where once we've discussed and described the interests of both parties, it seems at the first sight that the solution space is so huge. There are so many options potentially, how we could consider legitimate interests of each party. But why didn't we?
Yeah, so we are coming back to that question that we discussed a little bit earlier, and so I think I have to come up with some sticker explanation, some simple explanation, kind of which boils down to a memorable formula. And so my short answer, given the time constraints, would be that the dispute as such was focused on non-negotiable issues. That is one, and then secondly, the threshold between diplomacy and the use of force was mistakenly believed to be too high, to be quite high. So when Pin worked on an edited volume titled "Negotiating Security in Eurasia" some 5 years ago, it came out. We commissioned a chapter on the conceptual foundations of security negotiations, and we commissioned it from a world-renowned scholar who had done by that time plenty of work on security. His chapter unfortunately never made it to the edited volume, largely for technical reasons. But the point that author was making was that security is generally non-negotiable because it is so important. It has such a high priority. And the problem, he was saying here, is that security you cannot really measure. It is not some end state characterized by clear parameters. So if you are willing to split the difference, for example, as Fisher and Urey has taught us, then it becomes very difficult. You cannot really split the difference when you try to reconcile positions of the negotiating parties, because security is so much is so difficult to measure, right? So where that middle is, for example, where a focal point is for security writ large to be ensured, isn't clear. Whether you start fighting over security is a different question, and that again takes us back to what we just discussed with regards to the actual start of hostilities, for which we really need more evidence. So again, at the heat of this moment, many would say this is not a sufficient explanation, just some vague non-negotiability of security. But we do have several accounts of the mindset in Russia at that time, particularly one from William Burns and others. So it was clear that the sides, and especially Russia, were perceiving something that was going on as an extremely serious challenge, if not a threat, as actually a threat. And actually, we now hear that in Ukraine as well, there were very high-ranking officials and military officers who believed that armed confrontation was indeed inevitable, which is very interesting to hear now, given the apparent disbelief back in January and early February. But we don't really know many details of those perceptions. We again need more evidence to understand what kind of trends were seen as non-negotiable, say, by the Russian side. There were a number of versions, ranging from biological laboratories to NATO's penetration of Ukraine somehow. But I guess those assessments were classified or were not elaborated upon. So we really need more information about the thinking at that very moment.
Yeah, we have a question from one of our listener and viewer. Do you think the UN could have prevented the conflict if the US and Russia weren't reaching a negotiated solution? And if yes, how?
Yeah, well, the UN apparently wasn't being successful as a mediator at that point. What role for the UN at that moment, other than just sending peacekeepers somewhere, right, to prevent the start of actual fighting. But I guess, well, first the tensions were too high, and then second, of course, the sides would have utterly disagreed as to where those peacekeepers should have been injected. In broader terms, whether the UN as a negotiation platform could have helped, I'm not sure, because when tensions run so high, multilateral negotiation is particularly difficult to arrange, right? So you had Russia, China, you had Russia, US, and you had Russia, France, Russia, Germany tracks all happening at the same time, but they were separate, and there was no way to actually arrange for a multilateral meeting that would involve all those sides. So the most multilateral meeting involving Russia this far, I think, actually, and discussing, this whole problem happened in Samarkand. And there are different assessments of what happened there. But other than that, I don't think any serious multilateral meeting has so far tackled the problem, the tragedy. And so that's why I'm quite pessimistic about the role of the United Nations, where I think the sides are still vying for support from among those who haven't yet defined their position. So it's a tug of war, rather than it's a place where a tug of war occurs rather than a platform for the moment.
Mm-hmm. That seems like it. Yes, I know what you mean. If we try to envision, the next chapter, yes, I must admit I do struggle. Yeah, I do struggle. Although I would say I consider myself someone with a lot of fantasy. I do struggle imagining how this conflict might look like in terms of the next chapter. Yeah? What is your vision? What is your prediction as a conflict scientist who knows the country? Yes, what do you think would be the next step in the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Okay, so again, I'm trying to think in relatively general terms of negotiation theory, and I think of negotiation as first as this collective problem solving, again, Fisher-Urey style. Okay, that's the first option, the best one. And now there's no public information about good faith negotiations going on the main issues that I would say are territory and ceasefire. And this is the type of negotiation that again, Fisher-Urey said real negotiation should look like, and that is certainly not going on right now. But of course, negotiation may also be a process of probing the ground and just maintaining a channel of communication, and that may well be ongoing. For example, with regards to the rules of some future prospective negotiation, with regards to the issues that one considers auxiliary, secondary, such as prisoner exchange, for example, right? And relatively non-committal talking may be conducted informally at different levels, like Mr. Abramovich appearing on board the plane that was involved in the exchange of prisoners. And that kind of business may be going on, even in order to map up future scenarios which are not contingent on the outcome, on the near-term outcome of the fighting. But this far, the conflict is unfortunately headed towards more escalation. But the roles may be switching. So my takeaway is that Russia has been turning towards deterrence. It now says officially it is defending itself from encroachment. But at the same time, Russia is not suing for peace, right? And now the nuclear factor looms large. And it is indeed, and I think our conversation would be a failure if we didn't touch upon that. And it is indeed discussed everywhere in Russia, Ukraine, and of course the world media. So here I'm not very pessimistic. Even the seemingly most hawkish of Russia's official speakers suggest that decisions on the use of nuclear weapons are driven by Russia's known doctrinal documents and statements that only talk about responding to WMD attacks and also fending off threats to Russia's survival as a state. And there's an influential school of thought also, and here I put on my theorist hat, an influential school of thought that says nuclear weapons do not make much sense. That is because you either just commit a suicide if you use them massively, or you fail to impress your adversary if you use them in a limited way. And there's also a line of thinking to the effect that, for example, that Japan didn't surrender in 1945 because, or didn't decide to surrender in 1945, in August 1945, because of the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but because of the fear of a Soviet landing operation that would have resulted in the presence of Soviet troops on the Japanese soil and much harsher terms of peace. So Japan was getting a very heavy battering by the Allies, and the nuclear bombings back then wasn't much it was horrific, but conventional operations, conventional bombs were as bad as those, as the nuclear ones. So it didn't impress Japan back then. The story has it. And Russia is clearly interested in consolidating what it considers to be its territorial gains, and it argues it is now in deterrence mode, right? And theorists say that nuclear weapons are good for deterrence, even if they do not work for compellence. So you cannot really conquer territory relying on nuclear threats, but you may be able to hold on to what you have. And the problem currently is that you cannot really say who is compelling and who is deterring, right? So the sides may have their views as to what they are doing, but I mean, history is being made right now. The question is really when facts on the ground that you create become faits accompli. Right, so you think these effects on the ground, but whether they are faits accompli is a different question. And another problem from my personal perspective here is that for a threat to be effective, you need to formulate clear terms of settlement and then make a credible threat of punishment in case the other side isn't willing to oblige to meet your demands. And no visible negotiation problem at this time seems to show that there's no clear sort of vision. And signaling is also mixed. It actually seems to be broken, which worries me a lot, despite my general, not sort of giving up. So one may only hope that scenarios to end the conflict are being mapped out through some informal channels. Right.
And this is exactly the question I would. We probably slowly need to come to an end. But this is exactly the question that I spontaneously would like to add about what is your prediction in terms of the time to resolution. Yes, do we need to get ready for a long, protracted conflict that will last for years? Yes, or do you believe we're approaching a resolution, one way or another? Yes, you've mentioned you're optimistic, but I would be interested to find out more about your predictions with respect to time to resolution.
Well, I'm definitely not optimistic, and I think it's such an unrewarding task to to try and guess the sort of the perspective, the time perspective in this case. I think there are simply so many balls in the air that might either keep this going for a long time or may just somehow bring it to a resolution quite fast. The only thing I know is that acute crises cannot last for a long time. So in an off and on mode, this can unfortunately go on. But once it enters a certain intensity, once it becomes intense, then unfortunately a resolution is has to be forthcoming in some way. So I would just stop at that. I think again, too many factors, known unknowns as well as unknown unknowns. Therefore, I will just demur from making predictions at that point. Although I'm indeed very worried.
I understand. Thank you so for sharing this. So, what have we learned so far? Yes, you mentioned this conflict is ongoing, and events unravel as we speak. Yes, things. There are important events and announcements to be made, expected to be made within the next few days that can shape the intensity of this conflict. Yes, and I was wondering, as a international relation or a conflict scholar, as a citizen of this world, Russian citizens, yes, what have we learned so far? Yes, what are the lessons that we have already developed? Things that we can tell our kids. Hey, when you are in our age, do it differently, do it better.
Well, again, my takeaway is that things can get out of hand quickly, but equally that choices are extremely hard, and that juxtaposition of very hard choices with sides saying, well, we didn't and we still don't have any other choice but to prevail. Juxtaposition of that on the reality of things getting out of hand quickly is extremely dangerous, because it multiplies the damage, it multiplies the havoc, and the extent of that multiplication has become clear during this conflict. So I would say I was reading opinions by analysts back in the fall last year and early winter this year, who were warning against things getting out of hand and spinning out of control, and something really bad starting. And unfortunately, this is a lesson to be learned in terms of what kind of predictions can finally sort of bear out, so to say, because of this magnifying force of these magnifying power of these two factors that I just mentioned.
Yes, thank you for sharing this. So my last question is always the same. Yes, to all my guests, but answered always with a different angle. I was wondering, when you think about great negotiators, personalities that we urgently need, not only for this conflict but all around the world, to make better decisions and help us, make better collective decisions and come closer together rather than to reconcile rather than to fight. Yes, who comes to your mind from your perspective as a conflict scholar?
In terms of negotiating skills and actual impact and actual difference, well, I think Henry Kissinger is a safe choice for sure. Someone who was able to reconcile pursuit of the U.S. national interest with some ingenuity in actually reducing tensions and in winding down some conflicts, be it U.S.-Soviet detente or the Middle East, a number of Middle East crises. So that would be a safe choice, but also the way the Russian and the Soviet and American leaders managed to wind down tensions in foreign policy in the 1980s was also impressive. These are all recent examples that we lived through, so they naturally come to my mind. But other examples like Gustav Stresemann and some Soviet diplomats like Georgy Chicherin, who actually took Russia out of post-Bolshevik revolution isolation, and basically Stresemann did the same for Germany in the 1920s. Also come to my mind as I talked with my students about successful mediation and conflict resolution. But then things get out of hand in 1930s. The 1930s was an example. So our the lesson we may learn is that even if things go well on the negotiation front, so to say, there's a very small dysfunction that needs to happen for things to actually become very ugly and in need of new skillful negotiators.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your views, sharing your expertise with us and our listeners and viewers. Let me summarize. Yes, negotiation cannot prevent all conflicts, but it's only negotiation that can end them. Yes, Mikhail, thank you so much for being with us. It's been great having you on the podcast on negotiation. To all viewers and listeners out there, thank you so much. And until next time on the podcast on negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you, Remy. My pleasure.